Okay, Rachel, I think we can begin.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Rachel Odekal, and I'm delighted to act as moderator for this conversation. I'm a board member of the BC Black History Awareness Society. So the society was established in 1994 and celebrates the achievement of Black people in British Columbia by creating an awareness of the history of Blacks in BC, stimulating in the contributions of persons of African ancestry to BC and Canada today, and celebrating historical and contemporary achievements in the arts, education, government, sports, science, etc. So joining with me today, we have the curators of both the Sankofa exhibit and the exhibit in Victoria, Hope Meets Action. So today from Sankofa, I have Dr. Nuno Porto, Museum of Anthropology curator for the exhibition Sankofa, African Roots, Canadian Roots, who holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Coimbra, Portugal, where he taught anthropology until 2011. I hope I pronounced that right. We also have Titi Lopez Salami, guest curator for exhibition Sankofa, African Roots, Canadian Roots, is an artist, curator, and lecturer of visual arts at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, as well as Naya Lewis, guest curator for the exhibition Sankofa, African Roots, Canadian Roots. And she is a Vancouver-based independent curator and MFA candidate at OCAD. So I'd just like to invite you to just say a few words about your exhibit, whoever would like to speak about it to introduce the exhibit. Dr. Nuno Lopez?
I can go first and then and then leave it to them to complement anything. I just wanted, before starting, to state that I'm speaking, reaching you from the traditional, ancestral and unceded land of the Musqueam, Kwantlen and Tsawwassen people in what is still today the city of Richmond. And I'll begin by the subtitle of Sankofa, because African Routes and Canadian Roots was the idea of bringing the focus of the exhibit to, in a sense, to Blackness in BC. And we kind of chose the term Sankofa at some point because Sankofa, being an Akan proverb, is also a term which has been reivindicated and appropriated by groups all over the world, literally, as a symbol of African Renaissance. And so that's the whole idea of the exhibit, is to sort of twist the tables and bring what's not visible to the forefront. And I'm sure that Naya and Titi Lopez will have something to add to this. Thank you.
So in the idea of Sankofa, I mean, following the meaning of Sankofa, which is going back to look forward, is also to bring to the fore the practice of contemporary artists in Canada and also Nigeria. So the idea of Sankofa is to bring these artists together and then to show to the audience how these people have been going back in time, I mean, to write the history and how relevant their practice have been and how relevant their practice is in the present moment, as well as the connection between these works from both from Nigeria and from Vancouver, and how diverse they are at the same time.
Okay, next we have Josh Robertson, who's the curator for the exhibition Hope Meets Action, Echoes Through the Black Continuum, and was a founding board member of the Hogan's Alley Society, an organization that works to redress the displacement of people of African descent and to advance their social, political, economic, and cultural well-being. Josh, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, about the exhibit, I guess I would say that, really the context was really the foundation. The obviously Black history in British Columbia and in the museum had been ignored. It had been neglected. It had been covered up, basically whitewashed. And so really we started there, and it was important to us to subvert, that dynamic but we also didn't want it to, we didn't want to tell a story of pain, because that's often what we hear when we hear about Black history. So, I really think it was a positive assertion of diverse forms of knowledge dissemination through cultural practices. Of course, like any good, or maybe not any good Black exhibition, but it's very important to have, obviously we have that ancestral call and response, weaving the intergenerational and diasporic, the historical and contemporary together, and really reframing white typical spaces and design and programming. So, we tried to, basically reroute and reframe a very potent history.
Great. So thank you to our curators and as well as our guests today for joining us for this discussion called Black History Here, Now, Then, Always, the conversation across exhibition. So thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Sorry, Rachel, Naya is here as well.
Oh, Naya. Sorry, would you like to say a few words?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. You'll have plenty of opportunity to speak later on during the discussion as well. These are the curators, again, of Sankofa, African Roots, Canadian Roots, at the Museum of Anthropology, as well as Hope Meets Action, Echoes Through the Black Continuum, which is at the Royal BC Museum, done in partnership with the BC Black History Awareness Society. As we explore today the intersections across these two powerful and important exhibitions that uplift Black history and Black belonging in BC and beyond. So first of all, I would just like to acknowledge that we are engaging with you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, and also all over. So as we work together as partners and allies in the ongoing process of deconstructing and dismantling the historical and continuous effects of colonization in our spaces, relationships, and minds, we invite you to reflect on the indigenous land where you are located as well. Okay, so to kick off the questions, this first question will be to Josh and Titi Lopez. So what has been the response? What has that been like for both exhibits? Josh, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think that it's obviously been an amazing response. I think people have been waiting for this for a long time, and it's quite important, both exhibits, to the communities. But we were given an inch, and we attempted to rectify that. We were in a museum that was rooted in white supremacy and by disrupting and subverting. So I think that the response, like when something like this is made out of love and out of passion and out of it's reflective of the care, detail, and love that goes into an exhibition like this. We rooted ourselves in a community-based approach, and we all felt passionate, and because we had all experienced this history being neglected. So yeah, I think that we're hoping that it will be the start of many more stories like that.
Awesome. It's good to know that the passion came through, because when you're so close to it, it's hard to know if people are perceiving that. So Titi Lopez, what has been the response to Sankofa?
Yeah, okay. The response to Sankofa has been amazingly encouraging. I haven't been around. I mean, since the exhibition opened, I haven't seen it, but I've been seeing posts on Instagram, and then my co-curators have been sending me comments of visitors, despite the fact that it was my wish, at the beginning when we started planning for the exhibition, that more Black people will be able to identify with the exhibition. The rate at which people have accepted the show still remains very satisfying to me. And one comment that stood out to me so much was, I guess it was Dr. Nuno that sent that to me. It was a Nigerian that went to the show, and then she felt so touched. She also commented about how she would like to, take her old father to the exhibition to show him, the show, and she was really emotional about her comment, and that was really, really great, for me to say. So I would say the comment has been so great, and the response from the Black community and other people in Canada has been very good.
That's really great to hear.
Do you mind if I just follow up? I also just want to recommend that everyone check out the History Channel. put out a docuseries that features the exhibit. So, you know, there's a lot of media coverage for both exhibits, and I encourage everyone to check that out.
So the next question will go to Dr. Nuno and Josh. So in terms of the editing and selection process, what was important to exhibit and what other stories are we missing? Dr. Nuno.
Well, this, again, it's the kind of question that should be also be responded by Naya and by Titi Lopez, because the selection of items came from, I would say, a process, a very fortuitous process of continuous brainstorming and negotiation. What I thought, you know, retrospectively, what I think did happen was that we attentively looked at what contemporary artists were saying, and then we went back and forth to the museum collections to see how they could bring a background to the contemporary practice in a way, but also disassembling deliberately stereotypical images of African fragments. Our intention was never, on the contrary, it was very deliberately not to talk about Africa as a generality. We thought it was rather wrong to attempt to put 54 different countries in the space of a gallery, and we thought instead of bringing ancient ideas from Africa, which reflect the wealth of parts of Africa, both in terms of material and material culture, but also in terms of knowledge. And that's why we deal so much with written languages from Africa. And we ended up focusing in Christianity, Islam, and the cult of the Orishas, initially Yoruba, but then global, to comment from the perspective of the museum objects. I think one of the traits, but I'm inciting Naya and Titi Lopez to jump in, one of the traits of the three core groups that we have in Sankofa, which is contemporary art from Vancouver, contemporary art from Lagos in Nigeria, and the museum collections, is an attempt to rewrite the archive, an attempt to deal with oblivion, to deal with, as Josh was saying, the whitewashing of history, in a way that shows to our audiences, that brings to our audiences the possibility of two things which I think were very well achieved and are complex to do. One is a dialogue between contemporary artists from Vancouver and from Nigeria. And the second is the dialogue between contemporary art and ancient forms of art, which is what we have in the museum collections, which are anonymous objects and which are records and forms of creating knowledge as well, and of adding to our common archive. So this would be my first, take on that question, but I defer to Naya and Titi Lopez, if that's okay.
Yeah, feel absolutely. If anybody has anything to add, even if you haven't been called on specifically, please do jump in.
Naya, do you want to go?
I'm not sure that I can add anything to what Nuno shared. I think it was very concise and accurate. It's a long process. I think it's important to note that we were unable to open at our original date, our first date, when the show was postponed by COVID, but this show is almost 2 years in the making, in a sense, and we did start and stop at many times in many iterations, almost completely shifting the trajectory of this show at one point, somewhere around June, or something like that, right, Nuno? And so the process of editing in terms of what went in was almost also compromise and amalgamation of the first version and the second version. There was a lot of kind of like crossover and conversation about, at least for me, why the MOA collections were still, sorry, I have a very needy cat on my lap. Why the MOA exhibition and collection, sorry, the collections that belong to MOA, why they're still relevant to Black communities in BC after spending decades of not acknowledging Blackness or Afrocentric histories as something that could be viewed from a diasporic standpoint, why we needed wood carvings in the museum or in the gallery specifically, and how to do the work of mediating what I deem to be kind of this like violent barrier of erasure or a violent barrier of erasure or oppressive images or oppressive works by bringing contemporary artists in to have conversations from a perspective that we haven't approached yet. So I think the process was very much also wanting there to be this constant back and forth that embodied Sankofa as you walked through the exhibit as well, that we weren't just placing because Africa is an entire continent and we can't do an entire continent in 5,000 square feet. So what is it specifically that we're attempting to say? How do we create these kind of 6 pillars of kind of research lenses to which we can say here, this section is about this. And these are the kind of ideas that springboard out of that idea in this very fragmented way, because again, we can't say everything we wanted to say. Titi Lopez.
Okay, what I'll just add to what Dr. Nuno and I have just said is that we acknowledged from the beginning of the exhibition that what we have on the show are just fragments, because like the question suggests, there's no how we can cover our diverse African artists, and not to talk of the fact that we're not even just focusing on Africa, the African continent alone. We are also focusing on, Black art in Vancouver. So it's a lot to do. I mean, so it's not possible for one exhibition to, to cover that. So what we did was letting the people know that what we have are fragments. And then, so the aspect we brought together was to create conversation in the minds of the audience. And my hope in particular is that this conversation will outgrow the exhibition itself, and then that it will encourage more anti-racism action towards the Black in the foreseeable future.
For sure, it's definitely a struggle and a balancing act, because there are similarities among African people as well as the African diaspora, but there's also huge separate distinctions between cultures and so many of them. So Josh, for the editing selection process, what was important to exhibit and what was missing?
I mean, yeah, obviously a ton of things are missing. There's some things that we only briefly touched on, because ultimately we started in the pocket gallery and we busted through to the hall. But I was trying to count for 200 years of neglected foundational history. And the thing I'll say about that is that I really hope that we can start to move away from Black history, Black art, Black exhibitions being some sort of like shy, romanticized sideshow. They are the classics, and they should be treated as such, instead of pocket galleries and one-time shows. And I think Sankofa did a great job of this, but in general, like as everyone says, it's a bit wild to expect one exhibition to cover, all of Africa or Blackness or African diaspora culture and history. And I hope in the future we're able to obviously increase investment, space, and resources so Black stories can be centered and not romanticized or categorized. So, that this is a starting off point, and there's just an abundance of richness that, I hope in the future more people can expand upon and focus, and also just be centered in the ways that these other stories that we grew up with and have known in our society to be. For
sure. So this next question, well, I did want to add one more thing to that, I think that if these exhibits like these were less rare, more frequent, and we were expecting them to be recurring, we wouldn't feel the pressure to pack in all the information and all the important things into the one exhibit. So hopefully those things will change in the future. So for Josh and Naya, if you could speak to your experiences working with the Museum of Anthropology and Royal BC Museums respectively. Talk about them how you want.
I'm gonna let Naya go first.
Okay.
So I was brought in to the museum by Dr. Nuno because of my I guess, independent work that I have been doing around advocating for Black artists with critical art practices, curators, and documentation of Black cultural production in general, both in Vancouver and across Canada, from Toronto. And I think part of my work or part of my practice is very much so attempting to address the erasures in Canadian art landscape, and attempting to, as Josh so eloquently put, center and curate from the margins, to ensure that we take a very different approach to what Black culture production means, how it lives, how it's exhibited, how it's engaged with, and that we can do that from a lens that is specifically acknowledging African histories and philosophies as Indigenous. And so I think that whenever you find yourself with a curator who has a very particular vision and particular perspective, I consider myself to be equal parts curator and thinker and writer and activist. Going into a predominantly white institution is not going to be easy. And it wasn't, despite the allyship of Dr. Nuno Porto. We still, had all of the things, funding issues and payment issues and loan issues. And, there's this wanting after the global acknowledgement of police brutality and the kind of reckoning of Black lives that happened, to very, very quickly rectify, and again, this has already been said, centuries of ignoring these types of works, these types of thoughts and critical analyses, and fit them into one show. And I thought that it was challenging because I was up against this very particular opportunity where there was support and free reign for us to create, but also within the acknowledgement that we were the first, Titi Lopez and I, the first Black people to engage with the African collections in a curatorial role. So that means that in the years of MOA's history, there have never been Black people at the helm of the African collections in the museum. And in 2021, that we would be not just intervening with the collections, but our bodies and our thoughts and the way that we navigate our own practices also turned out to be a reckoning in itself and an intervention in itself. And that is extremely heavy and challenging to mitigate. We were the only Black reflections, Titi Lopez and I. And so, I could go on, but I think the challenge here is that the show is one aspect, and all the other systemic legs in terms of who's on the boards, who's tenured in African studies, what supports are being given to the African collections 365 days of the year, what other engagements, programming, auxiliary programming, and otherwise can be brought into center that might have changed the way that we experienced our collaboration with the museum. And hopefully it will be different moving forward. I want to be pragmatic. It'll be different. It will absolutely be different moving forward. But my experience was that although there was very, very, very dedicated and passionate and understanding people working on this show, the larger systemic issues that we have to concern ourselves with when working in predominantly white institutions ultimately prevailed in some of the instances. I'm sorry, I'm going to mute. I have a cat walking across my keyboard now.
That is both shocking yet so historically consistent. So thank you all for being pioneers in this space so that we can start change. So Josh, what was your experience working with Royal BC Museum?
Yeah, as Naya said, obviously I enjoyed tremendously working with allies, I'll point out that the BC Black History and Awareness Society, I think that was a great, you know, it was necessary, and it allowed an integrity and authenticity to it. The process by having it be rooted in community engagements that we had with the Black community to start. But we had great allies, but you know, institutional racism is not about individuals. It's about the system, the foundation, the rooting of institutions. And, you know, that's why I'm proud of what we did, because at least for me, I aimed to disrupt and subvert as much as I could. But that's not expressed, it's a challenge. There were copious amounts of what I will call moments of learning. There were copious amounts of emotional labor that are not accounted for in dollars. And, you know, you're hired as a curator, but when a institution has a history of systemic racism, that it's trying to account for, to give it credit, but you know, you're hired as a curator, but your second job is an anti-Black racism practitioner, because you're constantly, and yeah, I mean, I probably don't need to elaborate that. We all know what that is. So, you know, I am proud. I do think we had a sincere process in terms of the rooting in community, allowing for me to say that the place was racist and that it was a whitewashed institution, and to acknowledge that, and to give me that voice. And I didn't encounter very much, you know, people trying to stop me on that. But yeah, again, anyone out there who's thinking about doing something like this, you have to be ready to kind of fight a lot for your own voice and space. But I do think our process was a uniquely good one, and the partnering with the BC Black History Awareness Society and the centering of us as authorities, you know, as young people, it was, yeah, so.
Yeah, very collaborative. So thank you for that as well. So this question will be to Dr. Nuno as well as Josh. Josh, obviously, since you're standing alone on your side, you'll be answering all the questions almost. How do we curate with or against the archives? Dr. Nuno?
I'm not sure if I understand the question intuitively. I would say that we always curate against the archives in this kind of situation where we are dealing with works, in case of Sankofa, with contemporary artworks, which address the rewriting of history. And also we work in favor with the archives, in the sense of recreating the archive as we organize the exhibits. There's a number of installations actually that Maya did. Maybe she wants to address this as well. In Sankofa, one related to the Osama Sugar Company, and the other regarding Oganzale specifically, which are forms of rewriting the archive, or reinstituting the archive. But from the other perspective of instituting images of parts of Africa which do not, which are not commensurate to the common stereotypical view of what Africa is like, that's a work against the archive. And I would like to point out that one of the interesting exercises in Sankofa, which is not foregrounded, I mean, which is on the backstage procedures, is that we have been working with UBC students for a couple of years now, rewriting the catalog. And that we almost exclusively have on display in Sankofa until later today, because the exhibit closes today. Until later today, we have objects from the museum collections which had never been displayed as they are. So subverting, in many cases, the usual manner of displaying the objects is a form of both working against the existing archive and rewriting the archive for the future. So
I did see a question come up in the chat. Could you mention whose archive you're referring to?
I'm referring to the popular archive, to the idea that anything one does as a sort of a fragmented archive for future memory. An exhibition is something that when it results for future memory, it will state what is it that it changed in the ways of presenting things for the public, how it related to audiences and that sort of thing. So I'm talking about this this archive in the global sense of social memory, if you will, but also because we are using specific objects and specific artwork items in that archive for future memory, which are being activated by the exhibit in specific forms, right? I don't know if this answers the question, but.
So Josh, how do we curate with or against the archives, and which archives specifically?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I can still speak to the Royal BC Museum's archive because they probably have the best, you know, especially the historical 19th century stuff. You know, since our history and culture and art have historically been erased in this country, we had to work with every speck of archival content that we had, most of which, as far as I can tell, had only been really looked through by me and a few curious other Black academics. But again, since our history was not formally kept or valued, I inherently had to source stories from the community, and I spent much more time doing that. You know, just as an example, Black women who we want to center in the exhibit and story were not formally kept in record books at the time of, you know, the mid 19th century. So, or for example, Hogan's Alley history is only been really documented by a few Black academics, at least in a proper way, in my opinion. So it really took a lot of calling around and just talking to community, because I mean, ultimately, it's a much more authentic and powerful story when you can really trace through community these stories. But I mean, it also speaks to the fact that our history has not been kept in informal spaces. So yeah, it's you work with what you got in the archives, and you try to disaggregate as much as you can the you know, the white lens that's been put on those pieces to the extent that it has been. And it took a lot of crate digging, but yeah, I think I definitely worked with everything I had. But I think ultimately, with, you know, the work that we do, it's community based and community sourced for the most part.
Can I add?
That's interesting.
Sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add? I think, I'm not sure, Alice, Jim, in the comments, but there is like the big A archive, right? And then there's like archive in terms of community archiving, or the ways archiving in just a general sense in terms of the ways that we keep, protect, or preserve our own histories. But for me, curating against the archive is also the acknowledgement of what, as Josh said, gets to be documented and what doesn't, who's doing the documentation. The two archival works that I contributed to at Sankofa were both courtesy of the City of Vancouver Archives. And so for me, I think it's important to also note, just ever so quickly, that these are public archives. These are public archives that if you go in a searchable field, including, yeah, okay, cool. Including Royal BC's archive, if you put in Black people, nothing comes up. You have to search Blacks with an S dash dash, Negro dash dash, nigger, excuse my French, dash dash. You have to search things where we're finding systemic anti-Black racism, specifically in the way that we document and preserve histories. What does that mean for the histories and how they're presented, right? That there's been no interruption outside of Black academics who come in the aftermath of how these histories have already been presented and preserved, and try to do the work of working against that archive to present them in a way that both humanizes those histories and adds context to them in the way that they hasn't been presented before, right? I think that's also the work of working against the archive, right? That we acknowledge that socially, economically, and otherwise, we were not always able to write our own stories down. We were for ourselves, we worked to share orally, we had griots in our community, but what's available in terms of Black visuality, Black historical visuality across BC, what's available in the public big A archive? Nothing, hardly anything outside of Jay Matthews, right? Who's documenting us? And so I think that both exhibits do that work of centering Josh's voice curatorially, of centering our voices curatorially in and between the histories that we've come to know, by Josh bringing in Black women voices, by Josh bringing in community archives, interrupting what this public domain has held of Black visuality for so long. I just thought that was important to also note what's accessible versus the work that we're doing to create these alternative lanes of history as well.
I just got to big you up on that. I got to big you up on that one.
So further to that, Naya, what impact, you sort of answered it already, what impact does the curatorial voice have in terms of representation?
I think, again, I think there's like two parts. When you're handed an opportunity to curate in a space that has been active in the perpetual erasure. I'm trying to be so PC right now. Perpetual erasure of our histories, right? There's this extra pressure for acknowledging the way that representation works, but I also acknowledge that representation does not equate liberation. Representation does not equate accountability. Representation does not equate, right, doing the work. That's not nearly enough. It's a part of it, but it's not nearly enough. And so all that we can do as curators is to use cultural production as a vehicle to say, here's some alternate facts. Here are some alternate stories. Here are the ways that we see ourselves. Here are the ways that we can speculate other notions of how Blackness lived, breathed, walked, and start to record and document in a way that, again, curates from the margins and says, no, this to be truth in fact, right? Curates with methodologies that value Indigenous, and when I say Indigenous, I mean globally Indigenous, African Indigenous, stories that we carry in our heart that we pass down from our families as expertise. We don't need any other conversations necessarily. Curate with programming that allows Black academics, scholars, thinkers, writers, and all of this other ecosystem of Black cultural production to come together and create within this echo chamber of each other, right? This is how we kind of curate to representation without instrumentalizing the work. So to say that the work is doing enough, because it will never be enough, Josh, do you want to add? I feel like you want to add.
Oh, no, you're doing great.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what I feel this role is. I just don't, as Josh said, we come in as curators who are interested in art. Both Josh and I are doing MFAs, and then we're also educators, and then we're also anti-Black facilitators, and actually we're not. We're not. And so representation is important. And here we are presenting to you all of these works, all of these things, all of these objects, all of these stories. And all that we can do as curators is speculate the relevance of those things and use curatorial voice and use the kind of tools that we have in our basket to say, here's a platform for which we can view these in a different light. And I'm going to make sure that the things that we have control over, what they're in conversation with, how the labels are written, how the lighting and all of those gallery aspects work to preserve or to illuminate or to daylight a different perspective of Black history. I think that's all that we can do. That's all that we can ask of curators.
For sure. Yeah, African and African descent people have such a rich history of oral tradition. So when things are documented in a Western way, it also comes with a Western lens. So thank you for sharing that. So for Titi Lopez and Josh, how does activism show up in the presentation? Titi Lopez? You're on mute.
Oh, okay. Josh, would you like to go first? I'm trying to gather my thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, honestly, unfortunately, and at the same time, something to be proud of, it's really difficult to not have activism show up in the presentation if your focus is Black history. or diasporic culture, we are in the belly of the beast here. And unfortunately, just as me and many everyday Black people find themselves out of necessity to be activists. And our history is, you know, our history is one of struggle and of protests and of, you know, fighting for ourselves. So it would be difficult, I think, to not tell the story of Black culture, history in this context without including activism. It's inherent.
Okay, so I used to tell my friends that curating itself is more like an art process, and you know, artists are known to pour their emotions into their works, and one can almost tell what an artist is feeling at a particular time just by looking at the work. So for me, curating is more or less the same. So I believe for one to curate an exhibition or present something that show activism, one must at first be an activist. So I don't believe you can tell a story that you do not relate to it. So for there to be activism, then one has to definitely be an activist, and that is what I think we've done with the Sankofa exhibition, and the fact that Naira is an activist and I am an activist in my own way, has kind of shown in the way we presented our works and the way we curate this show. And I am glad that it has in a way been able to touch people, and people have been able to connect with this, especially Black people in Vancouver and all over.
Thank you.
Can I
Go
interject?
ahead.
Hopefully the last time I interject. I can't promise though, I apologize.
Never.
So one of the last pieces that we kind of added, well, maybe not last, no, please correct me if I get the timelines wrong. But we had all of these works, these beautiful works, and even with the works that Titi Lopez brought in, we think about Pedro, we think about Let the People Decide. Like, there are concrete works in the show that speak to activism, that speak to the ways that Black artists are thinking through liberation. And what we wanted to say at the very beginning of the show, I'm a graphic designer, you know, within my own practice and within my own right. And so that 42-foot curved wall that turned into this infographic moment was because I never wanted folks to come to the exhibit and to have an experience of Black or African cultural production that would suggest that they can segregate the way that they view this work from how they treat Black people in BC and in Vancouver in their day-to-day lives on the sidewalk. And so it was important that it was non-negotiable that BC Black History Awareness Society, that BC Community Alliance, so sorry about my cat, that Hogan's Alley Society, like, these are QR codes, direct links to their websites that were posted right on that side panel, conversations about what those organizations do, because the first thing that folks are gonna say, I had no idea. Oh my God, I've never known that, you know, and I didn't want them to get all the way to the end of the exhibit where we have that Still Writing Black Vancouver to think through what that means, because there are implications in showing Black art, especially in predominantly white institutions, that directly relate to the ways that we experience racism here in this city, in this province, directly relate to the ways that Black people have been able or not able to preserve and maintain community, right? We don't have physical land, physical space, physical communities here left. I mean, there's no gathering space, excuse me, just to be clear. That is not by accident, right? We're talking about how we are visually put forth in public spaces that are also activate as educating and socializing spaces. That's what museums are, right? And so I wanted to make sure that you knew that this was going to be something that challenged you, something that complicated your vision, your understanding of African art, but also more importantly, your understanding of African people, because they cannot be untethered.
Thank you. So this next question will be for Dr. Nuno, Titi Lopez, and Josh. How does Sankofa and Hope Meets Action mark or daylight Black histories?
You repeat the question.
or how does Sankofa mark or daylight Black histories?
How does Sankofa mark?
Or daylight highlight? How do they show Black? I know that Hope Meets Action was specifically a historical, had a lot more of a historical highlight, but how did Sankofa daylight Black histories as well?
Okay, I can start if
Go.
maybe Dr. Nuno can add to that. So for me, I think Sankofa illuminates Black history, bringing together stories from the African continent, particularly Lagos, Nigeria, and Black histories in Vancouver. The exhibition itself gives pointers to how Black people have lived and are still living in these two locations, and the effect of their past experience on the present generation. So I think that is the whole idea of this exhibition.
Yeah, I would like to maybe add to this the fact that when we're talking, I think in my mind at least, when we are talking about Black identities, we're not talking about exactly the same thing as African identities. And what I think one of the contributions of Sankofa as a whole is to that discussion on how Black and African contemporary groups are represented and how there's history brought forward, is the fact that there is in public representation generally a number of ideas about Africa which are just plainly wrong. I mean, people don't have the basic notion that there are over 3,000 languages that are spoken in Africa, and that many of them have traveled through the diaspora. I think one of the interesting numbers we got from the statistics, and that has made its way to the wall at the entrance, is the fact that the new migrants from Africa bring over 125 different languages to Canada. And so by highlighting the wealth of an extremely diverse heritage, I think we are, of course, as Naya said, there are limits for what we do as curators. We are opening doors to help people think that there are other ways of reasoning beyond the strictures of what exists right now. And it's up to each of us to do the work in many ways. But we can, and I'm in a different position in the sense that I'm a curator with collections, we can open those collections to different venues of understanding and to different paths for exploration beyond, what has been laid out by what is largely a colonial past, right? And I think that even though we have the notion that we got somewhere, it's never finished, because 5 years from now the problems will be different, and therefore our action has to address what will be happening 5 years from now. And I totally agree with Josh when he was saying that this form of activism is intrinsic to the way we curate exhibits, because if not, what's the point? I mean, isn't the point to change the way we think, to transform the world we live in a world which is better, and then move forward in this sort of ongoing permanent construction? I think that's the point, and I think what Sankofa brings, going back to the reception of the exhibits, MOA keeps comment books for every exhibit. I have never seen before in our comment books so much praise, so much proudness from visitors regarding the exhibit, so much identification. And I think part of it is because the perspectives which are brought about through the exhibit are commensurate with personal experiences. And that's, I think, a big change in terms of the institution and in terms of the archival approach to the collections.
Thank you for that. Josh,
Yeah,
how does,
I mean,
go ahead, go ahead.
sorry, did Naya want to say something?
No, that was me. I was just going to re-ask the question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rachel. You have something to say?
No, just how does Hope Meets Action mark or daylight Black histories?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the initial premise of it was that it was FUBU. It was for us, by us. We were focusing on Black people, and the exhibition was for Black people. So we're weaving the historical and contemporary together to try and achieve notions of Black British Columbians, because to be honest, we're literally starting from the point where most people don't have no awareness that there is a Black history in what's referred to as BC. So, I mean, that's our starting point. So I think, you know, my hope was that to create a holistic belonging, cultural healing, you know, being recognized, a sense of belonging, assertions of our presence and identity, being seen, understood, valued, the value of our history, establishment of our ongoing contributions, influencing Canadian society against the erasure and whitewashing, communicating a nuanced and diverse history with complex histories located in the real arcs of everyday people, and really just a sense of belonging, pride, and kinship amongst Black Canadians. And then from there, you can, you know, you kind of have what I hope, or what I think, is that for non-Black Canadians, there's this realization and then a reckoning, you know, like realization there is a Black history, then reckoning, like, okay, we don't have to go through that, but, and then hopefully, you know, at that point, a welcoming you know, welcoming those people at that point once they've had that process, and weaving the historical and contemporary together, and just, yeah, I think it's just an immersive experience that ties together, you know, hopefully, living oral history, media, material culture, and a contemporary response. And I think, you know, we expanded from the pocket gallery, and we brought in all this new contemporary history and contemporary art. And I really hope that, you know, added another dynamic to it. And really, we want to achieve the viewer being embedded in the experience, and that the viewer would become the thread that weaves a narrative through, you know, call and response interpretation.
For sure, thank you for that. So these next questions are from the Q&A. So anybody who'd like to answer, please feel free. But as we're talking about, Josh, the user being embedded in the exhibit itself, do you envision future exhibitions as an ongoing process of working with local Black communities and elsewhere?
Was that for me, or who was that?
Anyone can jump in, but I figured since you were just talking about.
Could you say it one more time? I didn't catch it, the question.
Sorry, one sec. I dismissed it too early. Do you envision future exhibitions as an ongoing process of working with local Black communities and elsewhere?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, until we have a Black run museum, it's an absolute necessity, because I mean, to be honest, these institutions do not have the capacity to really properly, like, vet Black people in terms of, like, okay, we're in school, we're put into, like, we're into special programs where they assume that we're less capable than we are. We don't show up in formal, you know, there's a lot of Black people with talent who do not show up in typical CVs in the way that white institutions want them to. So yeah, I definitely think that I was very happy that we started, the first thing we did was community engagements, because ultimately when you have the first exhibits of these kind, we really are, like, it's a lot of pressure. It's not a personal, it wasn't a personal journey, you know. It was a personal journey, but it wasn't my story, it was the community story, and that's a lot of responsibility. And the only way that you're going to achieve that is by basing it in community. And I think every museum that is, like, should take heed of that.
Anybody else like to jump in?
Okay, what I would like to add to that is that agency is very, very important. And then there's no one that can tell a people's story as the owner. So it is important that we continue to work with communities, especially the Black communities, to, in order to write and tell our stories, because there's been a lot of, whitewashed stories about Africa, about the African continent, about our art, and there's been a lot of generalization. So I believe we need to continue doing this, and that's I also believe that work is not with us, the curators alone. It also has to do with the audience. It has to do with the people. So we can only do our best. We can only put forth what we know, but we have people, we also have other Black people who have stories to tell. So this has to continue. It has to go beyond the museum. It has to be an ongoing process in order for us to have a Black run museum, like Josh pointed out, and, to keep the conversation going.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to Rachel Roy for that question. I think this is the last question that we will have time for. We'll see. And this question is from Martine Booth. What's the most rewarding part of creating these exhibits?
Can I go?
Sure, absolutely.
The most rewarding part of creating these exhibits is to demonstrate that we can create them. That it's actually two things. It's not only that alternative histories and stories and narratives are possible, but that we can do them. And what I would like to see coming out of Sankofa and of the exhibit from Victoria is possibly how this would percolate to the school system and to the education system, because as a recent Canadian, if I can express myself about myself in such a way, one of the things that is disturbing is the total absence in the education system of all these many issues. It's unthinkable, I think, in an healthy democracy, that the education system is a segregation system, so so shamelessly segregationist system. So I think the next step is actually, eventually, not necessarily the curating part. The next step is actually to move in a broader and in a more dedicated form to other instances of social reproduction of knowledge, where the doors we are opening in these shows become core values for education and for the future generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I thought to answer this question, like my first thought was just proof of concept. Proof of concept being the most rewarding part, because it was a long time coming. But to just acknowledge some of the comments in the chat that kind of work to this question around permanence. MOA has a permanent African collection. It has already been called to task multiple times. There doesn't need any more surveys, talks, panels, conversations. There doesn't need any more. We don't even need to be here to do this. Dr. June Francis has already done this. We've already done this. Wade Compton has already done this. We've already had this conversation, right? We just need to make sure that what permanence looks like for Black community is going to be ongoing and ever evolving, as it always has been. And so that we have access, right? And so that we already acknowledge that it matters who tells our stories. And so that there are Black curators in these predominantly white institutions permanently. So that funding, if not used inside those spaces, are being redirected towards community projects where maybe these things don't need to live there at all. Like, what does that, we talk about restitution, we talk about repatriation. What does that mean for Afro-diasporic communities, right? Like, this work, I say proof of concept is the best thing that came out of this, because now we can say, okay, we've done this. here are all the other times that someone else has done something like this. Here are all the other things that Black leaders in our community have already said to us about what this needs to look like. Just do it. Just make it permanent. Just make sure there's funding. Just make sure we have, you know, nuance in the way that Blackness is represented in this province. There doesn't need to be a panel about it. We can just do that. So for me, that was the most rewarding thing, and so that we can really call to task what needs to be called to task, because here it is in its 5,000 square foot glory, not just in Vancouver. Here it is in its pocket gallery glory in Victoria. Okay, now what? Right? At least for me.
100%.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually say two things. One is, you know, for me, it was a personal victory because I actually wrote a paper on this, was an essay in grade 10 on Black migration South Spring, and my teacher told me that he gave me a poor mark and told me that it wasn't relevant to the topic of Canadian history. So I was thinking about sending him an email with some of the stuff on the History Channel. But anyways, I also want to just really, I think it's very important that we call on, I want to call on the Royal BC Museum and MOA to ensure that they value, you know, we're talking about permanence and how these works will be brought in and centered in the future. And I think it's very important that both you know, institutions value and acknowledge our work. And as Naya mentioned, there's what typically happens is they have cycles where they bring in a new, you know, not necessarily the best vetted Black person they found, and they start the whole thing over again. And there's been so much work, and something that I hope we came through in our exhibition was the amount of work that I am standing here on. And what happens is a lot of times those people are erased, people's work are erased and, you know, co-opted and in all types of ways. And I just hope that, you know, going forward, that they value and acknowledge these exhibits and that comes through in the future works.
Great. Thank you all so much. I feel like we could talk for another hour, but unfortunately we have gone over time. So I guess the final thing, unless anybody has any last words, is just to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to the curators for taking the time out today to speak with us, and for all the hard work that you did on these revolutionary exhibits. And thank you to the guests today for coming out and listening to our discussion. So the Sankofa exhibit unfortunately ends today. Hope Meets Action has a little more time, but you only have until the end of the month, the 31st, to catch that. But these exhibits, I know Hope Meets Action will be traveling.
I think it's also, it's on for 2 more weeks in April now.
Okay. Awesome. So
April 14th.
Yay, that's great news. So please get out and see these if you can, or the traveling exhibits, and contact the Cures if you'd like to learn more. Again, thank you for coming, and we'll see you all later.